think one of the things that America has to face is the reality that it is an empire.
No, you must use it. You must use it because it make you rebel. Against what?
They were in front of Radio 8, shooting at the station.
No es un crimen defender nuestros propios derechos como pueblos indígenas.
Greetings and blessings. You're listening to the Travelogue Media Podcast. I'm Jason Clarl, podcasting from Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. Thanks for joining me. In this episode, Dr. Hadiya Sewer joins us via Skype to discuss her work with the Virgin Islands Studies Collective. Stay tuned. All right. Thanks again for listening. I'm really excited to be back. As some listeners may know, this podcast was hatched in the Virgin Islands in January 2016. So it's a real honor to welcome a Virgin Islander from St. John, Dr. Hadiya Sewer. Thank you so much for coming back on the Travelogue Media Podcast.
Hello, and of course, thanks again for having me.
Of course. So I wanted to just start out with a little shout out to Bajo El Sol Gallery, that's on St. John, the gallery and art bar. And just to mention a couple of recent events. The other night there was a book signing, Meditations Across the King's River by James Weeks, and also a film screening, Our Island, Our Home. And just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about those events and any other things.
Yeah, of course. So David and Priscilla Knight over at Bajo El Sol Gallery do a very incredible job of using the space as a venue for a lot of programs and initiatives that are generally very welcoming to the St. John community, including Virgin Islanders who may have ancestral roots in St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix, as well as the larger or the British Virgin Islands as well. And so recently, St. John Co., the St. John Heritage Collective, which is a nonprofit that David and I, as well as a few others, both sit on the board of, hosted a book signing with Mr. James Weeks for his recent book, Meditations Across the King's River, African Wisdom for Life's Journey. And it's actually a part of an ongoing project that he has. He has a blog also called Across the King's River and a Facebook page and a film in process with a similar title, Across the King's River. And really, it was actually a really incredible evening. We got an opportunity to hear about his relationship to African spirituality, which is somewhat transcending the territory as a location, in the sense that James Weeks is born on St. Croix, living in Oakland, California for quite some time, but also has traveled to continental Africa in the making of the film, but also in his own journey. And so it was a really great evening to be able to have the opportunity to talk about the book, to hear him read excerpts from the text, and to have a spirit-focused conversation, especially in a space where I think we usually talk more exclusively about some of the political dynamics of our island home. And so it was an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be able to have Mr. Weeks with us and to learn a bit more about ancestral veneration from his perspective, but also Ifa as a tradition, Orisha practice, and the ways in which this reverence for one's ancestors becomes really critical to his own life's journey, but also the creation of the book itself, which shares, some wisdom and advice from his path for attendees, but also for readers. And another event that took place in Bajo Sol that was a great pleasure to be a part of was the film screening. Miss Theodora Moorehead, who is the daughter of Senator Theodora Moorehead, one of St. John's primary advocates against condemnation of land on the island for the establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park, recently produced a film, Our Island, Our Home, that was directed by Dr. Crystal Fort Wrangler, where they really talked a great deal about Senator Theodore Moorehead's legacy, the importance of the advocacy that he did, but also the film makes a concerted effort to connect a great deal of his organizing back in the 50s and the 60s to the St. John that we see today. So several of St. John Co's board members, myself, David, Kurt Marsh Jr., were interviewed as a part of the film. And one of the things that I say in the film is that, Senator Theodore Moorehead is somewhat of a prophetic figure for his time, because when there was the attempt to condemn land for the establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park, he really foresaw the processes of displacement, gentrification, but even the over dominance of a wealthier philanthropic arm to the Virgin Islands National Park and the determination of the park's programming and activities. And so he's really a great deal of inspiration to a lot of us in the younger generation who are organizing today. Also, it's incredible to have to learn more about his story, in part because, as our superintendent recently pointed out to us, Nigel Field, that Mui, as he is affectionately called, Senator Moorehead, was successful. I mean, and this isn't something that we necessarily see in all of the parks across the nation, but he actually stopped condemnation. And in doing so, really created the opportunity for us to be able to even live on St. John in the capacity that we do today. And so it was great, really.
All right.
To get to work.
And I just wanted to ask if either the book Meditations Across the Kings River or the film Our Island, Our Home might be available for anyone listening who might want to. Is it available online? Can people get a copy of the book or the film?
So James Week's book is definitely available online. You can go to his blog Across the Kings River and his site, where there's a link there to be able to access and purchase the book. And then also, I believe it's available on Amazon, or it was the last time I searched for it on Amazon. And the film will be available shortly. It's not yet available. However, it will be distributed online and people will be able to stream it within, I believe, a week. So possibly.
All right.
Let's check back. There can be some notes making the film accessible.
Okay. And yeah, so if
and telling them where they can find it.
Okay. Okay, and so yeah, so another shout out to Bajo El Sol Gallery and Art Bar on St. John. If you're on St. John, be sure to connect with them. The great folks, way to get connected with all kinds of creative people, artists, writers, filmmakers, etc. And come to an understanding of St. John that's beyond just the beaches. And you mentioned another artist you were connected with in your work. Do you want to talk a little bit?
So Miss Theodora Moorehead, who produced Our Island, Our Home, is also apparently an artist. And this came as a surprise to many of us. But she has she recently had an exhibit in Bajo El Sol titled "Until the Spirit Tells Me to Stop," and it's really incredibly beautiful, ink on paper, intuitive drawings. And I believe that the exhibit perhaps is no longer up, but many of her pieces are still in the gallery. If visitors are on island and they want to stop in and see them. However, it's been an absolute privilege learning about her art, but also her process, having the opportunity to spend some time with her, both as she works on the film, but also being able to hang out and, watch her work while we're spending time together. And I think, and that's been pretty exciting.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. Any links to works you want me to include in there? I'm happy to put up those links in the show notes so that people can find out more. Let's continue with. I want to kind of pick up a thread from an earlier interview from back in October 2017, shortly after the hurricanes Irma and Maria came through the Caribbean and doing a lot of damage in the process. What are some things that you've seen happening on St. John? Things that have changed or developed in the course of the since the storms.
Right. So the recovery project has revealed, I think, certain challenges in our community, some of which pre-existed the storms, but were exacerbated by the storms. So on one hand, we, of course, have seen a mass exodus of Virgin Islanders. And it's somewhat hard to pin the numbers on this because various NGOs and government agencies don't necessarily seem to have an absolute consensus yet on just how many people left the territory. And we were actually discussing this earlier, but the enrollment numbers are down in our schools. And then we also have a mental health crisis where we don't necessarily have, especially on St. John, accessible mental health care for many individuals, some of whom are homeless either as a result of the storm or as a result of their mental health challenges. And then the storms have also impacted academic processes where schools and, educators are doing their absolute best to create a sense of normalcy for students. However, many students are still trying to make up the time that was lost as a result of the inaccessibility of power and, other resources, but also for the time that they were out of school, or for some people who may have been out of the territory and are returning back. There are just some unique challenges in the learning process that educators, students, and parents are attempting to navigate together. And so we also, of course, are still dealing with a lowered real estate inventory that is catalyzing a housing crisis, so to speak. House rent is going up and has gone up, and therefore many home spaces are increasingly inaccessible to many members of the community who are here, but also to those who have left or evacuated immediately after the storm and are trying to figure out their way to return home. And then, of course, these are just some of many challenges that we're experiencing in the aftermath of hurricanes Irma and Maria. But I think one of the things that the storms did do in a roundabout way is I feel like it really also forced us to be a bit more efficient in some of our organizing And I think some of the really inspirational things that have come out of this disaster are really the ways in which we are doing our utmost best to build stronger coalitions that will allow us to address some of these issues, as well as other issues like political status and how it relates to questions of disaster and disaster recovery. So I think some of the immediate challenges post-storm have shifted. And by immediate challenges, I mean things like power being out, people not necessarily having consistent access to food and water, as well as some of the immediate health access challenges that we were facing in the territory. However, I don't know that we've returned to a sense of normal completely. And in some ways, I think it has pushed us to create something new out of that hurricane season or the aftermath of it.
Right, and so I guess one of those new things, for at least that you're involved in, is the Virgin Islands Studies Collective. Do you want to talk about what some of the how that originated? What were some of the conversations you were having, and that talk about the origins of the Virgin Islands Studies Collective?
Right. So the VI Studies Collective is a group of artists, scholars, and community advocates who are deeply concerned with the United States Virgin Islands as a site of intellectual inquiry. And so we imagine the VI Studies Collective and Virgin Island Studies as being a multidisciplinary field where we critically engage many of the questions that are central, not only to our experience as Virgin Islanders, but also the Virgin Islands' contribution to local and global histories. So the collective members are currently Dr. Tammy Navarro, who's the Associate Director at the Center for the Study of Research on Women at Barnard, as well as Lavon Bell, who is, I believe, an artist in residence also at the Barnard Center for the Study of Research on Women. She's also quite known for her art on coloniality, and specifically as being the co-creator of the I Am Queen Mary statue in Denmark, which I believe is absolutely becoming iconic in terms of being a representation of Black women, but also of resistance against class and other forms of race and gendered inequality. And then we also have Tiffany Yannick, who is a professor of African American Studies and the director of the creative writing program at Wesleyan. And she's also the author of Land of Love and Drowning, which is a novel, and How to Escape from a Leper Colony, a set of short essays and stories, as well as finally a book of poetry called Wife. And the collective began really as a set of conversations between Tiffany, Dr. Navarro, and Lavon, who worked on or interviewed in a film, I believe called We Carry It Within Us. It really got them thinking about the Virgin Islands, our relationship to colonial powers, Denmark, but also the United States of America, and many of the questions of identity that emerge in the Virgin Islands as a space. And over another set of conversations, I continued or joined the conversations that they were having, and we became an official working group at Barnard in 2017. And so some of the central questions that we ask in VI Studies are, what does it mean to be a Virgin Islander? How do we understand the U.S. Virgin Islands identity? How is the United States Virgin Islands situated in discourses on coloniality, whether it's post-colonial studies or even neocolonial studies? and trying to really trace Virgin Islanders' contribution to African diasporic history, but also just histories of resistance and sociopolitical and economic organizing. And many of these questions pivot around the idea of, well, what type of future are we trying to carve for ourselves as Virgin Islanders? And then what are the intellectual questions that allow us to grapple with our past, but also our present moment, and to think critically about the type of future that we would be constructing and or moving towards. And so recently, we're still in April, right? So earlier this month, we had community forums on each of the three main islands of the U.S. Virgin Islands, on St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. And each of us led the respective community forum on the island that we call home. And so I am the St. Johnian in the collective. Tiffany Yannick is a St. Thomian. And Tammy Navarro and Lavon Bell are both from St. Croix. And so on St. John, I spoke a great deal about radical imaginaries and thinking critically about a genealogy of VI thought, and understanding that if we kind of trace the ways in which Virgin Islanders have thought and organized over the span of history, we start to see that we have a very robust and cohesive set of ideologies, and they're critically concerned with questions of freedom, of justice, of humanity, of questions of race, class, gender, and in the Americas, but really also in continental Africa and the globe more broadly speaking. And then Tiffany Yannick spoke in St. Thomas a great deal about questions of belonging, but also questions of othering. And if anyone has an opportunity to go on the VI Studies Collective page, and or even Conch Shell Media, because Dara Monica Cooper live streamed that event for us, it totally would be great to play back her presentation as well as the one that Dr. Navarro and Lavon Bell did in St. Croix. But one of the things that Tiffany spoke about in particular that really struck me was this idea that as Virgin Islanders, some of the identities that we value the most are identities where we may feel othered by other people who share those identities. And so for some Virgin Islanders, of course, we're under the US flag, so we may imagine ourselves to be American, but in a larger American imperial fabric, we're really in a peripheral, marginal, colonial position. And then if you look at the U.S. Virgin Islands in the context of the Caribbean region, we of course understand ourselves to be Caribbean people, but we're not necessarily a part of CARICOM. And so at times our Caribbean authenticity may be challenged by those who see or focus on the privilege of our position in the U.S. And then also, she talks a lot about this notion of always being in or diaspora as a VI condition, where it's such a transitory space. So many of us as Virgin Islanders, even those of us with deep roots here, have ancestry in other Caribbean islands. And so there's a great deal of movement and migration here, not only from the larger Caribbean, but also from people from the contiguous United States, and also just the sheer number of tourists that we see on island in any given period. And so when we speak of these processes of moving, as well as trying to carve out belonging and engaging with and responding to practices of being othered, that it gives us a lot to really chew on and to digest around the VI identity.
Right. So you held various workshops throughout the VI. So one in St. John, one in St. Thomas, one in St. Croix, and you were asking, or you were posing the general question: what does it mean to be a Virgin Islander? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what some of the responses you were getting from these workshops.
Yeah, I think as expected, we got varied responses, and one of the reasons we chose to host community forums with a workshop style component was We really want the direction of the VI Studies Collective moving forward to be dictated by the needs and the desires of the community. And also, people had, so there was a wide range of responses, and I'll just list a few of them. For some individuals, in order to be a Virgin Islander, you have to be born here and or the descendants of someone born here. For others, the idea of what it means to be a Virgin Islander is a bit more flexible, in the sense that if you arrive in the territory and you deeply commit yourself and invest in the community in a very robust and reciprocal way, then you can have the capacity to become a Virgin Islander. For other individuals, the question of a VI identity has to be couched in the question of what it means to be African and or to be a person of African descent. And in that particular context, the VI identity, how we understand ourselves and how we relate to each other, is really rooted in our experiences as people of African descent whose ancestors were enslaved in the region, if not the territory specifically, but also really centering Blackness as a way of meaningfully engaging with the question of what it means to be a Virgin Islander. And there was a lot of heated debate, as you can imagine, between, of course, civil debate, but a lot of back and forth about, well, how exactly can we frame a VI identity? Is it fair? Are we being exclusionary? Is this identity centering questions of inclusion to the point or to a point of marginalization or oppression of groups who may have ancestral roots here? And so it was actually quite a privilege to be able to sit down and to listen to such a wide variety of perspectives and opinions. And what I found really interesting in the St. John Community Forum is once one of these conversations or heated debates was taking place, we actually had a young person who's still in high school actually kind of bridge the gap between two competing definitions of a Virgin Islander and say, okay, well, maybe you don't have to be born here. However, perhaps your belonging is contingent upon acceptance by people who have deep roots in the community, who are explicitly saying, hey, you're engaging with us in a way that is mindful and conscious and aware, not explicitly harmful. And so for people who come to the territory and would like to be a Virgin Islander, quote unquote, that process of belonging is rooted on a deep respect for ancestral populations, but also a willingness to engage with the history, the culture, and the identity of people who have deep roots here in the Virgin Islands. And then while this didn't explicitly come up often, of course, one of the definitions of what it means to be a Virgin Islander is contained in the Fifth Constitutional Convention's proposed constitution, where the delegates penned a draft of the Constitution that argued that to be a native Virgin Islander, you have to be born here, or the descendant of someone born here. However, to be an ancestral native Virgin Islander, you have to either be born here at the time that U.S. citizenship was conferred to the people of the territory, or the descendant of someone who was there at that time and or before. And so there are a lot of really robust conversations around these issues, and I believe that the conversations were really generative and exciting, and I look forward to having continued conversations on this topic, or these topics, I should say, specifically because the identity question in the Virgin Islands is one of the biggest roadblocks in questions of constitutional development or political status, or even addressing some of the land rights issues that come up as it relates to property taxes, and the list going on and on. And so while it may seem like an existential exercise of sorts to sit down and say, well, who are we and why are we trying to define ourselves? Should we define ourselves or not? I think that our ability and willingness to engage in these conversations and to work through the existing definitions, but also the disparities in how we conceptualize these definitions will be critical to our ability to then pivot and address other issues that impact our community.
Okay, important questions, important discussions. We're going to take a short break and be right back with Dr. Hadiya Sewer. If you're enjoying this podcast, you can show your support by clicking the donate link in the show notes or by visiting paypal.me/JSKmedia. And don't forget to tell your friends. All right, welcome back. Dr. Hadiya Sewer, co-founder of Virgin Island Studies Collective. We're talking about the question what it means to be a Virgin Islander and some of her work she's doing in her community on St. John, St. Thomas, St. Croix, Virgin Islanders. And you gave a speech called Colonialism Without Colonizers about a year after after Irmaria, is collectively known Irmaria, the storms Irma and Maria. And you brought up a lot of the things you've just been talking about, and I'm curious to know if you have had conversations with British Virgin Islanders, and what are the similarities, what are the differences, if so?
So I'm a belonger in the BVI. So my maternal ancestry is in Tortola. Both of my mother's parents are originally from Tortola. My grandmother eventually moved to the U.S. Virgin Islands from there, while my paternal family has deep roots in the U.S. Virgin Islands and then also continental Africa, with one of my grandmothers being Ethiopian. And so there has been some chatter in conversations with family members about our political statuses in the British and U.S. Virgin Islands. I think one of the things that I feel most acutely is that the British Virgin Islands historically has had some policies and infrastructure in place that were very attentive to the needs and the desires of an ancestral BVI population. And the most visible of those policies and systems being the idea of having a belonger status and constructing the society in a way where belongers are able to then have certain protections despite a colonial relationship with the UK. And my understanding is also that the UK is currently challenging the belonger status of British Virgin Islanders and arguing that it's discriminatory because it quote unquote elevates one group of British people over another and therefore risks undermining the ties that bind the UK and the overseas territories together, end quote. And I think that where I find that, or one of the things that I say about that is this recent move by the UK is very reminiscent of a US and territory colonial relationship. And what I mean by that is that the US has long told the US Virgin Islands that we could not have policies and legislation that would allow for the protection of quote unquote native or ancestral Native Virgin Islanders, whatever term you choose to use to identify people with the ancestral roots here. And this most notably happens around the constitutional conventions of the U.S. Virgin Islands, where a part of the critique that we get, in some cases locally, but also at the federal level, is this idea that any attempt to define and provide certain protections to Native and ancestral Native Virgin Islanders is a violation of the U.S. Equal Protection Clause and therefore discriminatory. And so I want to say that I hope to have more conversations with people in the BVI about their relationship with the UK, but also ongoing processes of decolonization in the BVI. I think sometimes a part of the colonial condition is we're related, we're family, we're kin, and our islands are so close you could typically swim, or you can actually swim from St. John to Tatola, and yet still this kind of artificial colonial boundary in terms of who legally possesses the territory becomes a major, at times, dividing line in terms of how we even learn our history and therefore learn our ongoing struggles. But Richard George's BVI writer recently wrote a piece in the BVI Beacon called "The Empire is Not Dead," and it was a very brilliant and inspiring piece. I think it really galvanizes and evokes like a lot of emotion in like the reader, but also there's a part of it that I actually kind of want to just read really briefly because I think that it describes Virgin Islanders in both the US and the British Virgin Islands. And so, quote, he says, "What Virgin Islanders know by these facts is that the land they inhabit, the land in which they were born, the land in which they and their ancestors have labored, is not theirs. And this is a truth we know in the depths of our beings, and it is a truth that we spend our lifetimes attempting to forget." End quote. And that process of knowing, you know, in the pits of who we are, that this is our home, this is our ancestral home, we have roots here, our ancestors toiled in these shores under, you know, the oppressive system of slavery, but also even in the aftermath of slavery, they go through their own processes of reconstruction and attempt to create sustainable communities and lives. And there's a great deal of then development that happens in the contemporary moment. However, we still lack autonomy. And this question of how do we engage by this truth or with this truth? Do we attempt to forget it, as I think so many of us often do? And what happens at the moment for some of us when we realize that we cannot continue this intentional process of forgetting, that we do have to remember that this lack of autonomy kind of burns at our core a bit, and that we desire something better, something greater, something with a great deal more sovereignty. And so, yeah, I think that there are quite a few conversations taking place in both spaces about political status, but also about history, identity, culture, belonging, and what's required of us in order to be able to build a sovereign future, or a future that we don't have to try to forget is our reality, or isn't rooted in a fantasy, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Wow, this is so interesting. I mean, just yeah, it's. I mean, I guess it's easy to forget and to just the you know, the islands are, the U.S. and British Virgin Islands are so close, and each has a relationship with the U.S. and the U.K. respectively, and that you know, and it, you know, of course, UK's, there's discussions around Brexit. I don't know how that might affect British Virgin Islanders, but yeah, there's a lot that tends to get overlooked. So yeah, I had a transition I was going to go to, and I wanted to ask you about the new governor, not the president, the new governor of Virgin Islanders, Albert Bryan. I'm just curious to know, your thoughts on what he's bringing to the Virgin Islands, and if there's any significant break from the status quo, and what is it? Do you think it's going to be good overall for the Virgin Islands, or what are your thoughts?
I think my thoughts are, I'm hoping that it will be good overall, but by hope, what I really mean is I think that many of us are settling into a space in our minds where we recognize that no matter who's sitting in office, we will have to do a great deal of organizing and engaging with all of the various stakeholders in our community, and leveraging whatever resources are available to us to then hold our administration accountable. And so the Brian Roach administration, of course, ran on a platform of change course now. And so it still feels a bit too early to call or to properly or adequately assess what the impact of their legacy might be. But what I am excited about, and what appears to be a significant departure, is that the Brian Roach campaign actually included the political status question on their platform, with the intention of interrogating and possibly addressing our current colonial status and our relationship with the U.S. empire today. And actually, even in the film that Miss Theodora Moorehead did, Our Island, Our Home, there is actually some footage there in our lieutenant governor's inaugural speech. Lieutenant Governor Tregenza Roach, when he came to St. John as a part of the inauguration activities, he spoke a great deal about the dispossession that St. Johnians are facing and have faced throughout the history of the island, and the ways in which it seemed to him that this process of displacement was actively, or is actively, shifting not only the culture but the identities and even the ideologies of the people of St. John. And so it was actually quite candid and refreshing to hear a politician at that level of our government speak so openly and honestly, and with a great deal of empathy around some of the issues that are near and dear to us, but also some of the issues that we don't always get the sense that our political leaders are actively listening to us when we describe our angst around some of the challenges, whether it be the Virgin Islands National Park or gentrification, or the inaccessibility of quality food. And so it was absolutely refreshing to hear the Brian Roach administration set the tone for their ongoing tenure as our governor and lieutenant governor, with a very clear idea or perspective of what's happening currently.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the national park. I just remembered I wanted to ask you about that because I was in the States in December visiting family, and that was during the nearly month-long, or just about a month-long government shutdown, which of course I believe affected the national park on St. John. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so federal shutdowns typically do impact the Virgin Islands National Park, since it is a federal entity on island. And at times, this has led to park officials suggesting that many of the spaces and resources within the park are, of course, then inaccessible to members of the public. And I think for St. Jonians in particular, the challenge around this is that the park occupies over 2/3 of the island currently. And so, since this is in effect a park island to a certain degree, we tend to feel very quickly the impact of one of the largest stakeholders on island being temporarily absent. And so at times this, causes a great deal of conversation about, well, what's the economic impact of having such a large park presence? How will this shape our quote unquote tourism industry? How will visitors feel coming to the island and the park not being able to run business as usual? However, for me, it does, of course, go back to or highlight a lot of the challenges surrounding our political status, in part because we do not have representatives at the federal level, voting representatives, I should clarify, at the federal level, who we elect. And so it almost feels, or it is a situation where we are subject to the laws and the actions of officials who are not quite beholden to us in the way that one is beholden to someone or a constituent who has the right to vote for you. And so the shutdown, as well as many other issues, I think, over the past couple years have really, I think, driven this point home that we are appertended to but not a part of, that we are possession of the United States, and that we do not have all of the rights and privileges of some of our counterparts in the contiguous United States.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, that's sort of. I mean, I kind of wanted to mention also the other another major story that's come up in U.S. news is that is the 2020 census and the citizenship question. So it's even limiting even further, apparently, participation in democracy, or potentially could limit participation in democracy. And that's and for Virgin Islanders, that's you have a delegate to Congress, but there's no census in that. Is that correct?
So we have a delegate to Congress. However, currently we have a non-voting delegate to Congress. My understanding with the shifts in the census is that there's also an attempt to clarify forms of citizenship, whereas previously Virgin Islanders, which is kind of slip in, is, oh yes, we are U.S. citizens, and that is simply that. However, there is now this categorization of territorial inhabitants as being citizens separate from those born in the continental United States. And for many people in the territory, it's brought up a great deal of anxiety in a lot of the conversations that I'm seeing online about whether or not these shifts can then be used as a springboard for further political disenfranchisement.
Let's talk about the Green New Deal for a minute. What are your? I mean, one of the things you've mentioned in your speech, Colonialism Without Colonizers, was the contribution to climate change versus those most vulnerable to its impacts. So we've seen the Green New Deal emerge, and so there's a lot of discussion about that. I don't know in the Virgin Islands what kinds of conversations are happening as a result, and if there are any, maybe other directions apart from, obviously it would be great. It would be good to see the U.S. curb its contribution to climate change in any way it can, and drastically in a short period of time. But I'm just wondering what kinds of responses to the Green New Deal and issues of climate change you're hearing around the Virgin Islands.
Right. I think actually, I don't know that I go 24 to 48 hours without someone mentioning climate change and the question of climate justice here in many of my day-to-day conversations. I think the 2017 hurricane season, Irmaria, really highlighted our precarity. And for many of us, this vulnerability is as a result of anthropogenic climate change, but also other systemic forms of inequality, whether they be race, gender, class, political status, the list going on and on. And so having to continuously to have the support of the federal government, but also to feel to a certain extent like we're begging for support from the federal government really has forced us to think a lot more critically and ask ourselves and challenge ourselves to be more responsible stewards of our environmental resources. And on St. John in particular, this is a really fraught conversation, in part because the Virgin Islands National Park is incredible in terms of its capacity to be a beacon for a certain form of ecological conservation and even just consciousness around environmental sustainability. And yet that has come at a significant cost, and that cost being the sustainability of the ancestral community's relationship to what was once a sustainable ecology. So we can't necessarily hunt or whelk or, access certain lands with the capacity that we were once able to. And so we're really having a lot of conversations about environmental justice and climate justice, as opposed to, let's say, a traditional model of environmentalism that may be rooted in white supremacy, or that may come at the expense of Black and brown or poor communities. And so the Green New Deal's attention to questions of workers' rights, but also to justice as a central feature of our efforts to address climate change is something that I'm deeply excited about, and that I know that while we may not always specifically reference the Green New Deal in some of our conversations, it's something that's on our minds a lot, especially as it relates to sustainable models of tourism, but also workers' rights, and how so many of these issues that at times appear compartmentalized really do dovetail with one another, and at times are deeply entangled. So for us, we're really trying to figure a lot of these questions out, especially because historically we have a oil refinery on St. Croix. It was Havenza in the past. Currently, it's Lime Tree Bay. And the presence of this oil refinery, of course, has had a health impact on the territory. But I think long before climate justice as a term, or even environmental justice as terms, were household names, words or terms or language that people were generally familiar with. I think Virgin Islanders were having many conversations with the ways in which an oil refinery in our backyard may be detrimental, and why our attempts to move forward should really be critical of the fossil fuel industry, but also the form of economic systemic marginalization that would force a community to then be dependent on the economic contribution and the profits of an industry that we do not believe in on the level of ethics, but also one that we find to be harmful. And so we have many conversations on many different fronts around the idea of environmental justice, climate justice, broadly speaking, but really trying to ensure that justice centers intersectional questions about race and class and able-bodiedness and many of the other systemic power dynamics that will frame the ways in which marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change, but also environmental injustice, broadly speaking.
All right. We've been speaking with Dr. Hadiya Sewer. Thank you so much for being on the Travelogue podcast. There's a lot more I would like to get into, but I might have to wait for another episode. But thank you again so much for being with me on the Travelogue Media podcast.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. Of course, it's a pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners about a lot of the issues that we're facing here in St. John, but also the ways in which our issues are connecting to a lot of the problems that we're seeing across the globe.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
That's it for this episode of the Travelogue Media Podcast. Be sure to check out all the links in the show notes. You can follow Travelogue Media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search the hashtag Travelogue Media. Once again, you can support the show by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or by making a donation. Visit paypal.me/JSKmedia. And of course, if it's not spam, you can send me an email, podcast@Travelogue Media. New theme music was remixed from Wanderlied by Robero. Until next time, que todo sea amor, walk tall, live free.